Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Big East Rewind. I am your 7-foot host, Chuck Everson from Villanova University, and my point guard, my good buddy, my partner, Sonny Spera from Syracuse University. How are you, Sonny?
Chuck, I'm doing great. We have been working on this interview for a long time.
Yeah,
I told you I was excited. I'm a little nervous. I'm going to tell you the truth, but I'm really excited about it today.
Well, you know, another Hall of Famer has joined the Big East Rewind with us, which is amazing because we've had like 16 of them so far, if you're counting at home. You know,
hey, we keep this up, Chuck. People are going to want to come on just to get in the Hall of Fame. Just to want to get in.
Yeah, I'm sure that's it.
This is the springboard.
And, you know, usually, Sonny, we go back in time. The rewind is we go back to the future kind of. We talk about the old days and nostalgia and stuff. Well, we can't get any more current day than our guest today. I mean, you know, we got the boss on today. The commish is with us. So without any further ado, baby, I'm gonna introduce our special guest today. So she was a founding president of the Wnba, the former president of USA Basketball. You know, and I'm cutting this down because her accolades, Sonny, are gigantic. It's unbelievable. The current commissioner of the Big East and the newest member of the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. Please welcome to the show, Val Ackerman. How are you, Val?
Hey, Chuck and Sonny. What an honor to be with the two of you. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, wow. An honor for you. I mean, we thank you for coming in. Wow, that's pretty. You know, we're honored to be with you. Yeah, I mean, you know, first, you know, I have to ask you to just, you know, what was that like? The Hall of Fame. I was there. I got to see your speech. I was there, you know, supporting our guy Jay Wright. Yeah. We had a lot of former Villanova players there to support Jay. I saw you and your entourage there and your family and everybody. What was that like to get that phone call? Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, well, it was surreal, you know, tremendous honor, as you might guess, and a thrill to be going in with Coach Wright, to put it mildly. I mean, I said in my speech, and I meant it from the bottom of my heart, can't imagine who's done more for the new Big East, as I call it.
Yeah.
Than Jay and the Wildcats, and being part of at least sitting on the sidelines for those national championships in 16 and 18 was sort of a lifetime thrill for me, living vicariously through you cats. But it was, you know, lots of fun. You know, it was sort of my worlds colliding because, as you noted, I spent a lot of years in the pros. Yeah. And to sort of have everybody sort of gathered under one roof was really, it was very moving time for me.
How cool was it for you, Val, that, you know, it just coincided with the 25th anniversary of the Wnba, which you founded? You know, how cool was that? You know, I'm sure that the ironicness of that didn't fall short on you. I mean, you had to realize that was going on. Right?
Yeah, I think there's probably a little bit of a connection probably with there, Chuck, but it was, you know, last summer generally was, it was great to see the Wnba recognized for 25 years of just sort of, you know, being when the league launched. You know, no one knew whether women's pro basketball could gain a footing here in the USA. It hadn't happened before the Wnba came along. There were a lot of starts and stops. Yeah, the women's pro game. And so to have 25 years happen, and the last few years in particular, to see some traction around the players especially, but women's sports more generally, has been, for somebody like me, really very uplifting.
What was there any like lead up to the Hall of Fame? Did you have any, like, you know, was it close the year before? Did you have any inkling? How did it really come about for you in the last year and a half, 2 years?
Well, I was a Hall of Fame board member actually for many years as an NBA and then a Wnba appointee. And I rolled off 6 or 8 years ago after, you know, I was sort of the reason why we have term limits. I had many decades of service there. So I'm very familiar with the process. I actually came through, there were sort of a lot of avenues into the Hall. So Jay, for example, came through what's called the North American Committee, which brings in men's players and coaches, NBA and pro. There's a separate women's screening committee, and then there's a so-called contributor committee. And that's where I came through, the contributor committee. And I think I'm the very first woman to come through the contributor committee. That's usually reserved for, owners, NBA owners, David Stern, came through that committee. My good friends Russ Granick and Rick Welts, prior inductees. So that's how I came in. I knew I had been nominated, and that I was sort of up for selection. But to your question, Chuck, to sort of find out that it actually happened is, like, wow, that was a pretty cool moment.
Yeah, it had to be one of those mind-blowing moments for you. I mean, that's very, very special, especially since your history with the WNBA, and we'll get into that in a few. But and speaking of that, I'll touch on it now a little bit. Is that Sonny and I both have daughters, okay, and they both played around the same time. In fact, they've gotten to play, share the same court at a couple of times, a couple of games throughout the AAU circuits and stuff like that. But I got to tell you, the WNBA, especially from it was right around that time where our kids started to get into basketball, was when you started that whole conference and league. What a huge thing for girls to now have somebody to look up to. And it was really, really cool to see. Like, my daughter was a Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi girl. Those were her girls.
Right. And
I was fortunate enough to go to the WNBA All-Star game. And I'll never forget, because we went to the pregame like cocktail party or whatever. So we went to the thing and she got to meet them. And the picture is one of my favorite pictures of all time, because you could see her face explode, with excitement that she's with her heroes, And Taurasi didn't get it. So I said to her, I said to Diana, I said, you realize these kids are wearing your jerseys. You probably wore a Michael Jordan jersey or, somebody like that. She goes, yeah. I said, these girls are wearing your jerseys. What does that feel like to you? And she was blown away by that. That was a whole, that whole thing when it came about, and how it's carried on now for 25 years, 26 coming up, has been tremendous for young kids. Really has.
Yeah. And I can relate, because when I was growing up back in the late 60s, there were very few women playing sports in a visible way that you could watch and sort of be inspired by. And so I was, as a young basketball player back in that day, my heroes were the guys.
Right.
I had posters in my bedroom of Jerry West.
Yeah.
Date myself here. John Havlicek. Yeah. The Oscar Robertson. I mean, those were like the big name. Bill Russell, the Celtics, of course. And so I think you're absolutely right. And that was sort of when we launched the league, that wasn't lost on us. That now these young girls would have women, not just the men's players. And by the way, they're still looking up to the men's players, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But to have the women to look up to as well, and what that would mean, especially down the road, as those young girls grew up and, hopefully became lifelong fans, just like, men have had that sequence for many years. So it seems like it's paying off for sure.
Well, you were the driving force behind the WNBA, and you had to run into roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. I can't believe the path was easy, because I'm sure it was, this is not going to be just, because it was going to be an athletic league. It wasn't going to be like a glamorous thing like they talk about in the, League of Their Own, where it's like, oh, we want this certain personality. Yours was going to be an athletic league. So you talk about coming, 180 degrees. Talk about the challenges that you faced when you set up the WNBA.
Well, Sonny, there were plenty of them. But I will say we had a pretty good shield with David Stern. I mean, I can't say enough, and I miss him dearly, about, sort of talk about driving force. This guy, I don't know if you knew him, he was a force of nature. And so he got it in his mind at some point early on in his commissionership that there was going to be a women's NBA. And I think, he needed to figure out, we all did, how best to sort of line up the stars so that could happen in a way that wasn't just sort of being dropped out of the sky. And we were lucky because early in my career at the NBA, the league was beginning to forge a relationship with USA Basketball. Mm-hmm. In fact, that was one of my first projects at the league, was to be one of the liaisons between the NBA and USAB. And that led to the first Dream Team in Barcelona. And that was one of the coolest things I've ever worked on, to be, planning that team's qualifying tournament in Portland in 91. And then, of course, playing in Barcelona in 92 and everything that followed. And it was really on the back of the successes with the men's team, that we, the NBA, to involve ourselves with the women's national team that played in
Which
Atlanta.
you started.
Yeah. And we orchestrated a year-long tour that led into the Atlanta games. They won every game. And this was the great team of Lisa Leslie and Cheryl Swoops and others. And so with that sort of wind at our backs, it really did make the launch of the WNBA in '97 seem more logical, seem like a natural progression, if that makes sense. And, to your question, though, it was massive amount of work to start a new league, even with the NBA's backing. I mean, we had to do everything from scratch. And there were naysayers, I think, really at every turn. And I'll give David again credit, because he wasn't going to hear any of it. This was going to happen. He was going to get sponsors. He was going to get the networks. And it was sort of left to the rest of us to bring it to life, which we did. And, as she said earlier, it's 25 years later, and here we are. So again, a great thrill, but that synergy between the NBA, USA Basketball, and that led to the WNBA can't be overlooked when they kind of write the history of all of this.
And the marketing of it, because you had to really market it as a separate league. So, because I read some things about, you engaged companies and you showed, this could appeal to this segment and these people. Talk about how you did that, because I'm sure you're involved with that as well.
Yeah, very much so. And that was one of the theses. Was that there was, we thought, a separate fan base for women's basketball. And we could attract to the game people who were not otherwise supporting the NBA or college basketball. But at the same time, we thought that an NBA fan who loved basketball might be attracted to this summertime programming. And that was the reason one of the reasons the league played and continues to play in the summer months. So as not to go head to head with the NBA or college basketball. Interestingly, the overlap hasn't, and I've been gone for a while, but we noted early, the overlap wasn't what we expected between the NBA and the WNBA fan. It really was sort of separate audiences. But, at the same time, I think we were able to capitalize on the fan of women's college basketball. Yeah. And, I would just tip my hat here. One of my schools, you guys remember the University of Connecticut well.
Yeah, we sure do.
We had a break with them. There was a break, but they're back. And I can't say enough about what, I was actually at a UConn women's game recently. And I just, it's at Gamble, and I just remain in awe.
It's frenzy.
What's been built there by Coach Wnba and the great legends that have come through that program over the years. We've got, Paige Beckers, who's going to be the next one in the chain here. And so to see what's happened at the collegiate level, I would say the WNBA really was built on the back of the national team in part, but really on the back of everything that had been happening in women's college basketball and, at the lower grassroots level.
Now my daughter in AAU, I got to mention this because Chuck talked about it, but my daughter in AAU was a junior, and there was this young, gangly, full of braces 8th grader from Syracuse by the name of Brianna Stewart, who was on her team. And you could see that she was good, but you didn't know how good she was going to be. So now talk about a connection to the pro league. It's like, yeah, I'm friends with Bri, so it's really nice to have those connections. So, go ahead, Chuck.
So when you were being recruited to go play at Virginia, right? You were one of the first females to get a scholarship, full athletic scholarship to Virginia, right? And 1,000-point score. So you played back when Old Dominion was, with Nancy and those guys, right? So how do you think, the women's game now, how do you think it's evolved from back when you were playing in college to current day? And, I think from a basketball person's perspective, I think a lot of people like to watch the women play because it's more of a pure game. It's pick and roll, backdoor, give and go type stuff. And they're not playing over the rim yet, that day's coming soon, I think. But, it's more of a purist game. And what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's right, Chuck. I mean, I think women's basketball at its best is about just solid fundamentals, right? Good ball handling, great shooting. And, now with the advent of the 3-point line, you can see women shine. I didn't have the 3-point line when I played. I wish I did, Probably would have gotten a few more points.
But had a few more points.
Yeah, because I was a little bit of a bomber. But the answer to your question is it's night and day. I mean, I went to Virginia at a time when, women didn't get to go to UVA as undergrads till 1970. And so I sort of came down to Charlottesville in the fall of 77. And, I wasn't sort of aware of all of this because most 17-year-olds aren't. But it was, the team, I was sharing the only scholarship, the men's team at that time. You guys will remember the great Jeff Lamp, Jeff Jones, Lee Raker. Lamp and Raker were in my class. Sampson was a couple of years behind us.
Mm-hmm.
And so the men were it was glory days for the men's program. And we were really at the ground floor. Yeah, and that wasn't lost on me either, that like the men were here and we're sort of down here. But the good news is we got better every year. Debbie Ryan, our coach, who was Gene Corrigan's niece. Gene, of course, the AD at UVA then, who went on to become the commissioner of the Atlantic Coast Conference, one of my heroes. They pushed. We got the resources. We got better every year. And it was really exciting in its way to be part of sort of that phase, that era, if you will, of women's college basketball, to see it growing. Old Dominion they were beasts. I mean, they were just incredible. It wasn't just Nancy, it was Ing Nissen and others, Angie Kottman. I mean, they sort of carved us up every time we played them. But but the game has progressed beautifully. I mean, you see now more parity. For example, you see the skill level of the players, the athleticism, the importance of conditioning, all the things that have elevated men's basketball have happened on the women's side as well. And I think it'll only grow.
Now, when you finished college, you played a year pro overseas, right? What was that like?
Well, it was challenging because I went to a country where I didn't speak the language.
Sure.
And that's, I had my Berlitz with me on the plane, so I could say a few phrases to my hosts. But I really, I played in France. And frankly, for me at that stage of my life, it was the semester abroad I never had, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense.
I had a chance, all expense paid, to go overseas. I played for a club team in Central France. I still drink that wine. The Loire Valley wines were great. Pouilly Fumé, my favorite. And, again, it was a chance for me to broaden my horizons before I, kind of came back and pursued another dream of mine, which was to go to law school, which I did, a year later. And that kind of really made my career in basketball possible, to be honest, because I, came into the NBA eventually as a lawyer. And that wouldn't have happened had I not gone to law school, practiced on Wall Street for a couple of years, and made the connections that got me into the league. So, but that experience in France was great. And I tell young women all the time, if you have a chance to go overseas, try to make the WNBA if you can. That's the pinnacle. But if you have a chance to go overseas, it'll be a life experience for you on top of being a basketball experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like that for the guys too. I mean, it's always nice to get away from your comfort zone and go see another country and participate and be a citizen almost in the country. You act like one of them there. It's very good for everybody's psyche and everything else. So look how many
foreign players are playing in the NBA now. So it's the bridge is there. So.
But just the lifestyle and stuff, just to do something outside your comfort zone is great,
And Chuck, I think for me too, I mean, especially in this day and age, to sort of see what the world thinks about America. Americans, it's pretty sobering, and I think a great part of your education, and it's humbling. And if you can I picked up a little French while I was there. I didn't remember much of it, but there's so much about the personal growth that comes with the overseas experience. So you're right, for men and women alike. It's a worthwhile experience if you can swing it.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough. I got to do that myself for a season or two. It was really eye opening. You're right. So you go to UCLA and get your law degree, right? And now, how do you go from UCLA to the NBA?
Well, with a detour. When I got my degree, I kind of it was there that I said, okay, law, sports, combine. Let's bring these two things together now. And I tried coming out of law school. My summer between my second and third year, I summered at a big New York firm. But I really wanted to get a job in sports coming out of law school. And I tried, but every door was shut. I mean, there weren't many opportunities at all back then. This is now in 1985.
Probably didn't take a female serious in some of the sports venues.
But there weren't like in-house legal departments were tiny.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't many of them. I mean, the business hadn't exploded, in a way that we have it today, either pro, college, or otherwise. And so I took the advice of my kitchen cabinet at that time and got a job, just took a job on Wall Street with a big firm. Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, the hiring partner, seemed like a nice guy when he came to UCLA to recruit. They had a reputation for not, being too hard on their associates. And they let me choose. I didn't know whether it was corporate or litigation. They said, you could do both, do 1 year vote either, and then you can decide. And other firms were much more rigid about, having to choose right out of the gate. It was like things like that, that kind of informed me. And so I went to Simpson and sort of, life got in the way. I met my husband, Charlie, there. And we decided eventually to get married. And when that happened, he stayed at the firm. He went on to become a, longtime partner there. And I left, and I kind of then hit the pavement and tried to find that dream job in sports that had eluded me coming out of law school. And it's a long story I won't bore you with, but that led me to the NBA through a contact at a time when their legal department was really small. Gary Bettman was the general counsel.
Right.
David was in his fourth year as commissioner. The legal department was all of 3 people, and they were creating a new opening. They needed a staff attorney to sort of be help us out on a bunch of stuff, kind of job description. And so it was, we'll talk about best days of my life, getting that job, 1988. Started out at the league, and things just kind of progressed from there to a time when the league was 100 people. Things were just new, and many exciting endeavors were sort of on the horizon. So it's really a very exciting time to be associated with that organization.
You talked about a lot about David Stern. Talk about was he one of the guys that mentored you as you came in and kind of took you under his wing a little bit to help you foster your way through that situation with the NBA?
Yeah, no question. I mean, I started out working for Gary, who's now, of course, the commissioner of the
Right.
NHL.
NHL, yeah.
My other sort of, boss there was the deputy commissioner, a long time, named Russ Granick. Sort of amazing leader in his own right. He was sort of yin to David's yang. And so I was working basically for Gary. Then I moved over, started working with Russ on the side. And I'd been at the league for about 18 months when David called me into his office, did not tell me why. So I go in there, I'm like holding my notepad, my pen, trembling, wondering what the boss had to say to me.
Right.
And it was, he kind of hemmed and hawed, and in his roundabout way asked me if I would come work for him in a job, like a sort of chief of staff kind of role that, basically brought me into the commissioner's office in a pretty significant way. And it was amazing. I mean, it was a little of this and a little of that. And I really, had a chance to be at the elbow of one of the, great sports leaders of all time. It was sort of witnessing brilliance every day. But that said, tough boss.
Yeah.
Made me cry on a couple of occasions.
Really?
Didn't quite get it right. But, as I go about my work now, I don't think really many days go by where I'm saying, okay, like, what would he do? Like, how would he handle this one? What would be his decision-making process around this? And to your point, Chuck, yeah, I mean, you don't get, no leader gets to where they are without another leader in the wings, bringing them along, opening a door, telling them what they did right, telling them what they did wrong. And so for me, that was, very much Russ and very much David. And we may get to this question, and in his way, Dave Gavitt, who I had a chance to work with early on, before I started working, started working on the Wnba because of my USA Basketball and Hall of Fame connections. Dave Gavitt was the man. I mean, he was the president of USA Basketball in the early years of the Dream Team. So Russ and I worked with him on that. He eventually became chair of the Basketball Hall of Fame. Russ and I were on the board, worked with him on that. And Dave, I could go on and on about what a great leader Dave was. And of course, an honor now to be sort of carrying on his legacy.
I was gonna get to that, but Val,
Yeah, you just let us right in there.
You're truly a pioneer. It's almost like you're in front of the curve, not behind it or pushing it. So as a pioneer, it's got to be a little bit scary on each of these fronts. It's almost like you're breaking new ground each and every time in different areas, NBA and the legal team, and now the USA basketball. Talk a little bit just about personally what it's like to be in that position.
Yeah, so I can't really answer that. I mean, don't really think about that when you're in the moment of it.
Yeah.
I've always been a bit of a striver. I don't know, sort of drives my family crazy sometimes because I've always worked pretty hard and not, frankly, don't let myself smell the roses very often. But I will say, yeah, I mean, along the way here, I haven't had many women, at least, to look up to, my journey. I mean, I was working on basketball matters. I was working on, NBA salary cap and collective bargaining matters in my early years at the league. I'm dealing with people like Willis Reed and Elgin Baylor, and Jerry West, who by the time I got to the NBA, they were all GMs, and they're calling me like with urgent messages. Hey, we need you to tell us what to do on this trade, and so that's pretty humbling to be dealing with a guy like that on that level. But there weren't many women, honestly, and I had some tough times, especially when I had kids, because my bosses did not know what was going on with that. They didn't know had no ability to relate to a woman in their workforce who was having children. And so I guess where that's led me is now to be really sensitive to that. And I work pretty hard now to make sure that I'm helping the young women who are coming behind me, and trying to make it a little easier for them in terms of guidance, or, hey, here was my experience and maybe you can learn from that, because they're as much the future of the sports world as their male colleagues are. And I just think it's, the obligation of people in my position to sort of pay it forward, if you will, and help those who are going to follow me someday.
So talk a little bit about now. How do you connect with Dave Gavitt? What's the first introduction, and where does that start to mesh?
Well, Dave, as I mentioned, Dave had asked Russ and I to work on the first dream team. I remember Russ Granick coming into my office in early '89 and saying, hey, I know you're working for Gary. The office was very small, by the way, and Gary reported to Russ, so he had no say in the matter. But he said, hey, there's this thing coming down the pike. He started detailing for me how the International Basketball Federation was about to change the eligibility rule so that pros could henceforth be eligible to play in the Olympics. This is 1989, after, what happened in '88.
Right.
And so I'm like listening to all this going, hey, that sounds pretty cool. Sure, I'm happy to help you, Russ. And so that, sort of led Russ and me to begin our relationship with Dave, who at that time was the head of USA Basketball. He was president, which is basically that, board chair there. And so we had, began to, assimilate basically the NBA into what was then called ABA USA, Amateur Basketball Association of the USA. And there ensued this whole long list of what had to be done to get the NBA players to Barcelona. Everything from having the NBA join ABA USA, which then had to rename itself USA Basketball. And Russ, Rod, Thorne, and I were among the first board members. We were the first NBA board members. Dealing with the qualifying tournament. That dream team didn't get to go to Barcelona out of the box. They had to qualify, believe it or not, through our zone. So that was in Portland in '91. We had to sort out all the marketing issues with the U.S. Olympic Committee, and the players, because they had their endorsement deals. And just, it was sort of like this huge logistical, sequence. So, Dave was the guy we dealt with, as well as with the, then USA Basketball's full-time staff in Colorado Springs. So I, again, honored to have met Dave through that. He was a great guy to work with. He was at that time the commissioner of the Big East. And in fact, you guys may have the date handy, but it was either right before or right around the time of the Olympics that Dave sort of stunned the basketball world and took the position at the Celtics. And I think became, head of basketball operations for the Seas. And so there it was. And I think maybe part of it was because of his exposure to the NBA through his experience working with all of us. Dave was a great politician, super smart, had an amazing way of, sort of leading, building consensus, et cetera. And so when the opportunity years later presented itself for me to, again, sort of, take the baton from, I guess it was Mike Oresco, back of my mind was like, man, this is just too cool. I mean, because, here I am doing something that Dave set in motion.
Yeah, we had Mike Tranghese on and Dave's son Danny on, and they both talked about his vision and his people skills to be able to bring people together. We've talked about it on several different shows that we've had on, Val. Is he would do things if Sonny and I were in the meeting, the coaches meeting, and we weren't getting along, we'd find ourselves in the same golf cart having to play a round of golf together, or at dinner sitting next to each other. Did you see any of that at that point when you guys were working together with the Dream Team stuff?
Yeah, to a degree, although I think Dave had more challenging circumstances to deal with there, Chuck, because it wasn't all that easy
right.
to bring together the NBA and college basketball back at that time. There really wasn't a super strong relationship at that time between sort of the two associations. In fact, right. Russ and I were points also with the NCAA apart from USAB. And frankly, the guy we dealt with was Tom Jernstedt. You guys may remember Tom, sort of father of the Final Four.
Yeah.
Longtime, senior administrator in Indy. And so he was the guy that was on the USA Basketball Board, and he was the NCAA's appointee to the Hall of Fame Board. So Russ and I kind of got into that circle with Dave and Tom and the men's college basketball world. And then later I became the bond between the NBA and the women's college basketball world because of my playing days at Virginia and contacts that I had still maintained with the coaches community and so on. And that led the NBA to do some things to support women's basketball in the early 90s around the NCAA Women's Final Four that, we were able to sort of build on and amplify when we started working with the national team in 95. So I guess to your point though, Chuck, relationships really matter in this business, as I'm sure you guys know.
Well, if you can't understand that,
you can't understand it, you shouldn't be in this business.
It's just right. Basic. I mean, it's really a basic tenet. And one of the things with Dave Gavitt and one of the beauties of, like Chuck talked about, his ability to have 12 balls in the air and know which one to get and which one to put up and which two to put next to each other and all of that. And you worked among some of the greatest minds and leaders of our time. I mean, it's just an awesome opportunity. And, the fact that now you can ingest some, spit some out, what have you, and develop your own style. And now you're in his shoes and being the commissioner of the Big East. It's really a full circle. It's just beautiful. Yeah.
So talk about that now, Val. I mean, now, it's a good segue going from Dave to the Big East in current day and what you're doing now. So
hey, hold on. You like that? See, we're professional. We talk segues
very good.
now.
You guys are good.
Like that?
Wow.
We're professional.
Seamless.
Yeah.
Seamless.
That's right. So talk about now the Big East. We were a part of the old Big East, as and everything happened with football and teams were leaving and all that stuff. And now you got to get together and put together, what's left and put together the pieces and form a league, which, by the way, is right back to where it was. The basketball is outstanding. I watched, this year in particular, it's so wide open. Just about anybody could win the tournament coming up. So talk about what that was like to put all of that together and put the pieces together.
The new Big East.
Yeah, the new Big East. Well, I'll just sort of confess here. I was the outsider looking in back in, call it circa 2012, when the old league blew up. I mean, you guys, right. And it was, it was sort of like a little by little and then boom, right? Because there were many defections. I mean, schools, got added mostly because of football. You
Yep.
all know the history. And then started
Still hurts me.
because of football. And so it was around 2012 that the so-called Catholic Seven decided to withdraw from the old Big East. They were basically saying football is just ruling the day here, and that's not in our interests. So they made the decision to withdraw. They brought in sort of very succinct summary here, brought in Butler, Creighton, and Xavier, themselves proud basketball schools, and then sort of got themselves recertified as a new conference with the name Big East. We're able to keep the name.
Yeah. We're
able to keep the Garden contract.
The Garden. Yeah, it's huge.
And then importantly, the timing was fortuitous because Fox at that time was about to launch FS1, a new national sports cable channel that they wanted to, have compete with ESPN. And so they needed the programming. So the timing was just, really opportune for Fox Sports and the new Big East to come together. And that, the Fox Sports opportunity fortified, I think, the decision of the 7 plus the 3 to say, okay, we're going to do this. So all that unfolded with the help of a lot of lawyers in the early part of 2013. And so I take no credit for the formation, but once they kind of got through that and the smoke cleared and they said, okay, now we got to hire somebody to do this. Then, the search firm got to going, and then I got the call. And so that led to, me taking on the job of commissioner in July of 2013.
Right.
And, it has been just an amazing 9-year run, to your point. I mean, I don't think anybody knew if the new Big East could do it 9 years ago. It was daunting. Nobody knew if a basketball league could still make it in a football world. It sounded good that the league was going back to its roots as a basketball-centric conference, but this was a new day. And so it was very challenging. Frankly, the first couple of years, I didn't have a staff. We didn't have offices. It was just sort of me running around with trying to get people on board with a lot of help from our schools. But I think that year first year we got 4 teams in the tournament, and then it just sort of progressed from there. What I will tell you is it's a great league. I mean, I know it's my league and all that, but it is a great league. If you're a basketball person,
oh yeah,
this league is unbelievable. I mean, the games I'm going to, how competitive it is, how fully invested all of these teams are now, especially in basketball. The addition of UConn, which was a journey to bring them back, has been, I think, just tremendous on all fronts. The rivalries that have been reignited, the new rivalries. I mean, when they play Xavier now, it's like a war. What we've been able to do in other sports. I mean, we've got soccer powerhouses in the league. Women's basketball has been upgrading, and UConn is helping us do that. Villanova, in fact, Chuck, you may know, Harry Perret is retired after a great run, and Denise Dillon has got this going there. So I think, it's all good. Where the future lies is a big question, because there's a lot swirling around college sports generally right now. I mean, as you all, I'm sure, are tracking, and I'm sure other guests have noted, I mean, with name, image, likeness upon us, the transfer portal has freed up movement. So our coaches are all trying to figure out how to manage that. The NCAA is doing this big governance review, and that may result in some restructuring in D1. So there's a lot of things that we have to pay attention to that are sort of not visible to fans, but I think have the ability to profoundly impact the direction of college sports and college basketball in particular. So, but all that said, I'm bullish about our prospects. And I think for us to combine the great history that we've had with the promise of tomorrow is kind of one of the most exciting parts of the job.
What are some of the challenges? Because you just hit, I was just going to ask the question.
I was just going to ask the same question.
The NIL, and the transfer portal, what kind of challenges have come up with that kind of stuff? And, is it becoming an issue? Because, Sonny and I had talked about this a lot on the air and off the air, we look at it because we didn't have those opportunities. Okay. And after we won in 85, there might've been some opportunities in 86 for those guys, but that said, I see a lot of problems that could be inner turmoil type problems with teammates of, you go back home and your friends are saying, hey, how come Sonny's making more money than you, or whatever there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of different pieces to that. So talk about what some of the challenges have been for that and the portal both, because now it's so easy for a kid who it was, maybe not sure if this is the right school for him, can just, check into the portal and be someplace else the next season.
Yeah, that's right. Those two forces are new. They are, going to put our coaches, to the test in terms of how they can manage it. Let me just start. NIL was sort of an unstoppable development. I mean, I actually co-chaired beginning in 2019, a national committee. Gene Smith from Ohio State and I were the co-chairs on what to do about NIL, because it was coming down the pike. States beginning to pass laws. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I would have figured that you'd have had a part in that, because that just fits with your MO. You're in front of it.
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
amazing.
I got asked to do it. I was like, oh, okay. And what was happening, states like California leading the way were passing laws that were saying, regardless of what the NCAA does or doesn't do, or prohibits or doesn't prohibit, we're going to allow any athlete that goes to a school in our state to have these opportunities. And so we saw it coming. Frankly, philosophically, Chuck, to your point, it was the right thing to do, to allow these athletes to have these opportunities, because other students have these opportunities. So why should they be, impeded? But the question was, how do we make it work in a world where we have the possibility of significant booster involvement, where we have recruiting inducements? I mean, the pros, there's no recruiting in pros outside of free agency, as you guys know. You get to choose, you don't get to choose what NBA team you play for. You have to go through the draft. So it sort of cuts down on the funny business that you could see in a recruiting environment. And so the question was, how do we make this work in college sports? And to make a long story short, the problem is there is no national rule around it. We were not able to get that done for a variety of reasons, all legal. So there is no national rule. So a player who wants to go to Villanova may see a different NIL framework than a player who wants to go to Syracuse. And they may end up comparing, hey, wait a minute, there's less restrictions in Villanova. Right. And that may be because Pennsylvania law makes it so, by the way, than there are in Syracuse. So that could really sway a player in a way that's, I think, going to be maddening to our coaches. So without a national standard, there are a host of challenges for sure. Whether that can happen or not, nobody knows. It may require congressional involvement, which would be a double-edged sword. Of course, if that were to happen, because it would be, Congress couldn't come in and bless this without some, taking something back. And so that's probably one of the bigger questions. Transfer portal, the same. I mean, athletes can now, in basketball, transfer first time without sitting a year. They can play right away. Second time, third time transfers have to sit under the current rule for a year. But I think what we're seeing is coaches are now going to avail themselves of the so-called portal to stock their rosters in ways that didn't exist a couple of years ago. And I think more than anything, that will affect how they go about high school recruiting.
Yeah.
And so I think roster composition and roster retention will be particular challenges going forward. How it all plays out over time, no one's quite sure yet, but definitely two major developments.
I think that's really hurt the Georgetown team and Patrick, because he's had a couple, 2 or 3 years in a row. Now here he is with no senior leadership on his team. And that we all know how important that is, I mean, continuity, you can't bring somebody in and teach them a program and start to get into your culture and all of a sudden they're gone and you got 3-4 new guys and now you got to start all over again. So some of these teams are struggling with that. I don't know how you get around that though, because it's,
Well, it'll put a premium on. I mean, that's just a fact. Coaches will have to get really good at sort of, moving quickly, trying to build culture very quickly. I mean, Coach Wright's done an amazing job, as you know, Chuck, at Villanova. And I think for that reason, he's got a great culture and he will be successful with retention probably in ways that some other programs won't. But yeah, that, and then, again, just sort of the general forces around, and the employment status of student athletes and all those sorts of things are also on the board. And we could see some significant changes in the coming years.
Do you see any growth in the league coming up, Val? I mean, you brought UConn back in the fold. Do you see any other teams down the road? I know you can't talk specifics, but do you see other teams down the road coming into the conference?
It's possible. I mean, I will say our schools, they were really happy with 10. UConn was sort of the one school that, and even though they're very different from the current Big East schools because they're a big public university that's still playing FBS football, all the other boxes got checked with UConn. And so that was the school that, sort of was top of the list. So everyone was prepared to go to 11 and still keep the full round robin in the basketball schedule, which has been, we think, really advantageous. Everybody in our league, it's a balanced schedule. Everybody plays everybody home and away. And we kept that going with UConn. So we have a robust conference schedule. It's 20 games, which is a lot of games. I would say future expansion is possible, but there'd be a lot of factors that would have to sort of, be satisfied in terms of values, basketball, what it can, contributes from a basketball standpoint. I will note we are in our 9th year of our national television agreement with Fox that I mentioned earlier. And there will be a point in a couple of years where we're going to sort of go back to the market and sort of see what the future holds there. That's a critically important relationship for any league, and especially a league like ours that doesn't have football. So, we will be thinking in the coming year or two, would sort of member composition, a change or an addition help us? With our media rights position, that'll be a factor. Too early to say at this point, but to answer your question, I mean, I don't think at this point you could rule anything out in terms of growth.
Val, I got 2 questions. First, I'm going to cut right to it. Sorry. How can we get Syracuse back in the Big East? Let's just put it out there.
He's been in mourning since they left.
Specific. How can we make it happen?
Well, you'll have to talk to John Wildhack, probably for one thing. They're a very well-respected AD. Of course, came out of ESPN. Very talented guy.
Good man.
I don't know the answer, Sonny. I mean, I think, as best I could tell, this was a decision that had a lot to do with, football.
Yeah.
Football. And so I think that's really going to be the crux of it for any school like that is, the revenues from the autonomy conferences now are pretty significant. They are driven by football and what football is commanding, particularly in the media rights space. So I think those are the calculations that a school like Syracuse and others have to make. Would it be great? I think that, wow. I mean, every time Syracuse plays a Big East school, you can feel.
It's great.
You can feel the vibe.
There's nothing.
You had something great going there for sure.
Yeah.
We were at both games, the Georgetown game we went to and the Villanova game at the Garden with Syracuse. So it definitely, both games had Big East feels, and unfortunately for Sonny, his team didn't come out on the right end, but that's that's the breaks, Val,
Hold on a second. Okay, let me ask you a question. My final question I want to ask you is, I just think as a woman in your roles that you've been through, and I still think as a pioneer of all those things, and you talked about bringing other young women. What do you feel in terms of any pressure, or what do you do to help promote that? Because I have two younger daughters that are in their careers, and it's like, look at what Val does. That's doesn't mean you have to be the old boys network. You don't have to be this, but relationships are key. Just talk a little bit about that, because it's just so impressive.
Well, that one, I mean, if I were to offer any advice, Sonny, to, anybody who's looking to advance in any business, and sports is no exception, I would say the relationship piece, super important in our business. It's a hardworking line of work. I mean, to be honest, I made a lot of sacrifices in my career to be here. I mean, this is weekend work here. I mean, most, a lot of sporting events are on weekends.
Right.
I've had killer evenings. Travel in my career. Yeah. I was Wnba when we launched. My kids were 3 and 1, wow. And we had a summer league, and your kids are off in the summer, so put 2 and 2 together there. That was tough. But I think, and sort of, I've had setbacks in my career, just like anybody. And I think coming back from adversity, you learn that lesson, as as you guys know, in sports, you're not going to win every game. And so, but you got to come back tomorrow, and sun comes up, and you go through, have to sort of pick yourself back up and keep moving. So I think if you can sort of get your head around sort of those ideas, and you're good at what you do, and can latch on to a mentor who can open doors for you and help you move through the system, if you will. And I think your chances are really good to keep moving. And I will tell you, there are so many opportunities in sports now that didn't exist when I was coming up. And so whether it's in the pros, men's sports, women's sports, college sports, the national governing body world,
and career paths,
my dabbling. Yeah. The Olympics. I mean, there's there agencies, NBA, networks, NIL companies. I mean, things, that are kind of hitting that didn't exist a few years ago, particularly in that world. I think there's loads of opportunity there. So I would be very encouraging to any young women who wants to get into this business. And I've talked to many, and will continue to do that, because I think they're clearly part of our future.
Thank you.
Well, what better way to wrap this up, Val, than that's perfect. The perfect way to wrap it up. Thank you so very much for being our guest and joining us today on the Big East Rewind. We really, really enjoyed talking with you.
Putting up with our jitters.
Guys.
Putting up
with likewise, guys.
That's
Thank
right.
You.
Great being with you, and look forward to seeing you at the Garden.
We'll see you at the tournament. We'll be there.
So impressive. So impressive what you got going on. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Yep. Keep up the great work.
So much, guys. Take care.
You've been listening to the Big East Rewind with Sonny Spera and Chuck Everson. The Big East Rewind was produced and directed by Nick Chico Chorus and Daryl Gurney. You can check us out on YouTube. Put in Big East Rewind in the search bar, and all of our shows will come up. And we ask you to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Thanks a lot for joining us. Have a great night.